Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? My family finally put a price on me, and it was the cost of one luxury vacation that I wasn't invited to. They did not say it outright, of course, but when you get a group text with a photo of your parents and your younger brother sitting in first-class seats, champagne glasses lifted like they are in some airline commercial, and the caption says, "Wish you were here," but you were never even offered the chance to go, you finally realize where you stand. They told me later there wasn't enough space, and that I needed to rest anyway because I had been working so much. That explanation might work on a kid, but at my age it just came off like they had already decided I was useful only when they needed me to pay for something, not when they wanted to celebrate or enjoy themselves. The truth is, this vacation wasn't even about space or rest. It was about priorities. And for years, I was never their priority. I was the one who quietly paid the family phone plan because Mom said bundling saved us all money, except that it came out of my account every single month. I was the one who added Ethan, just temporarily, to my plan when he couldn't afford his own, except temporary somehow stretched into years. I was the one who paid the HOA fine last spring because it would ruin Dad's credit and, of course, the streaming accounts, the charity donations in the family's name, the endless little charges that only ever landed on me because I was the responsible one. At the time I told myself it wasn't worth fighting about, that it was easier to just swipe my card and keep the peace, but sitting there staring at their champagne photo, I realized I had been keeping a peace that didn't even include me. Then, by accident, I discovered something that lit a fire in me. I checked my card statements to make sure the phone bill had cleared, and there it was. Ethan was still an authorized user on my credit card. He had put a hotel hold the month before without even telling me. I stared at that charge until it felt like the letters were burning through the screen. My brother was drinking in a lounge, on his way to the Caribbean, and part of that access was still tethered to me. In that moment I decided that if they could plan a trip without me, I could plan a future without them. And unlike them, I would not leave loose ends. I opened my laptop, pulled up my spreadsheet, the one I had kept mostly for myself, just to track bills, and I started cleaning house. First, I called the credit card company, had Ethan removed as an authorized user, and set new passwords on all accounts. Then I called my phone carrier and stripped every ad online that wasn't mine. The rep even laughed softly and said, "Looks like you've been footing the bill for a while." I canceled the premium streaming package that billed to my card, and when the confirmation email hit, it was like someone had taken a weight off my chest. Next, I moved my savings out of the so-called family emergency account, the one my parents insisted we all contribute to, into a new account under my name only. I set fraud alerts on all major accounts and locked down my credit profile. Every single, "just for now," or "you're the only one who qualifies" hook they had used on me was gone in a single afternoon. It felt like revenge, but not the loud kind. It was quiet, calculated, and perfectly legal. And the best part? I got the first taste of justice almost immediately. While their flight was still somewhere over the ocean, I received an email alert. Ethan's attempted airport lounge charge had been declined. I sat back in my chair, let out a laugh I didn't even know I had been holding in, and thought to myself, this is just the beginning. Because if that little hiccup annoyed him, he had no idea what was waiting on the other side of customs. That was the first decline. The second one would be a lot louder. When I saw that first decline charge come through, it felt like a tiny spark, but I knew deep down that one spark wasn't enough, because the truth is this wasn't just about money or a vacation. This was about years of being the dependable daughter who could be counted on to keep the lights on, to pay the bills quietly, to cover the family's mistakes while they all smiled in public and pretended everything was fine. So when they excluded me from that trip, it wasn't an oversight, it was the natural result of a pattern where I had become less of a person to them and more of a resource they could dip into whenever they needed. For a while I had told myself I didn't mind because family was family, and in the end we all looked out for one another, but the truth was much uglier. I looked out for them, and they looked out for Ethan, and I was simply convenient. I kept thinking about all the little ways I had been used. When my uncle had surgery and couldn't get to his appointments, It was me who took time off work to drive him back and forth while my parents said they were too busy, but somehow they had plenty of time to plan parties and golf outings. When the church needed donations, my mom proudly told the congregation that the Carter family had covered the shortfall, but she never mentioned that the check came from my account. When Ethan bounced another check and needed rent money, they called me and framed it as helping your brother get on his feet, except Ethan has been getting on his feet since he was 20 and he is now well into his 30s. Every time I said yes, I thought I was keeping the family together, but now I realized I had been keeping myself trapped in a role that wasn't love but servitude. So I sat down and pulled years of statements, and I wrote out a clean timeline of everything I had paid for every phone bill, every fine, every loan payment, every so-called emergency. I didn't write it to beg for recognition. I wrote it like evidence, because for the first time I saw that the truth itself was enough of a weapon if I used it correctly. Then I did something I had never dared before. I sent an email to every immediate family member. I didn't rant, I didn't cry, I didn't even insult anyone. I wrote a clear, factual message that laid out exactly what I had covered, with dates and amounts, and then I set new boundaries. I wrote that going forward I would not co-sign anything, I would not cover temporary bills, and I would not host, plan, or pay for family events. If someone needed something from me, they had to send the request in writing, and I would decide case by case. I hit send, and instead of dread, I felt something close to relief. The family group chat lit up after my email, but instead of engaging, I posted one final message. I was leaving the chat, and from now on they could contact me at the email address I had just shared. That was it. No drama. No explanations. I removed myself and silenced the pings, and for the first time in my life I felt free from their instant access to me. A few minutes later, a cousin texted me privately and wrote, "Proud of you." We all knew. That single line landed heavier than anything my parents had ever said, because it meant I hadn't been crazy, and people really had noticed the imbalance, but they just assumed I would keep taking it. I didn't stop there, because I wanted them to feel not just my absence, but the cost of what they had taken for granted. For years, the annual holiday dinner reservation had been booked under my card at a local venue, and everyone treated it as though it were a Carter family tradition that magically appeared on the calendar without any effort. This year, with one phone call and a polite email, I canceled their reservation and reassigned it. The venue manager asked if I wanted to keep the date, and I said yes, but instead of listing it under the Carter family, I registered it as Carter Scholarship Night, a small fundraiser for a local student I had decided to support using the refunded deposit from Ethan's unauthorized charges on my card. It wasn't just revenge, it was redirection, turning wasted money into something meaningful, something that couldn't be spun into another photo op for my parents. The best part was knowing they would not find out immediately. They would still be on that beach, drinking out of plastic cups with hotel logos, thinking I was at home sulking, when in reality an email confirmation would already be sitting in their inbox from the venue, politely notifying them of the cancellation and noting the non-refundable portion billed to their account instead of mine. The holiday dinner they loved bragging about had just evaporated, and when they tried to call the venue, they would hear the truth. Their daughter had not only canceled, but had replaced them with something that actually mattered. I didn't need to shout or make threats, because I had finally realized that power isn't about being loud, it's about being precise. They had always relied on me being too polite to draw a line, but now the line was written in bank statements, email confirmations, and cancellation notices. While they were drinking on the beach, an email hit their inbox from the venue with my name on it, and attached to it was a cancellation fee in theirs. And that was only the beginning, because if they thought losing a dinner reservation was bad, they had no idea what was waiting in the fine print of all the papers they had made me sign years ago. By the time the venue confirmation settled into my parents' inbox and the scholarship receipt posted under my name, I had already decided that the next part would not be about feelings or family tone or whether anyone understood my point of view, because the next part would be written in clauses and signatures and the kind of small print commitments that outlive arguments. And the funny thing is that once you take emotions out of it and look at the paper like a stranger would, you notice that The story you have been living inside is not a story at all, but a stack of obligations that someone quietly placed on your back while calling it love. So I made coffee, opened the folder I used to avoid because it gave me anxiety, and I began reading every page I had signed for the sake of peace. What I found first should have humiliated me, but instead it clarified everything, because buried in the autopay history and the DocuSign archive was a cosign on Ethan's truck that I had agreed to for 6 months back when he swore he just needed a start, and not only had the 6 months stretched into years, it turned out the payments had been late more than once, and the late marks were sitting there in my file like stains I never made. And the idea that he was sipping rum somewhere while my credit carried his mess finally hardened into a decision I should have made long ago, which is that I would stop feeling guilty for doing the right thing just because it would make someone else uncomfortable. I called a consumer attorney for a single paid hour because I wanted to know exactly what to do without theatrics, and I took notes like my future depended on it, which in a way it did. And the plan turned out to be simple in its structure and merciless in its timing. Send a written demand to refinance the truck out of my name within 30 days, copy the lender, and include documentation of the original assurances that the cosign was temporary, then place a freeze on my credit across all bureaus. Follow it with a fraud alert so any attempt to pull my file would ping me first, and finally protect the perimeter by revoking every permission that used to let my family open accounts for convenience, which by now I finally understood meant for access without accountability. While the attorney explained that contract law does not care about family dinners or good intentions, only about the signatures and the deadlines, I realized that my whole life I had been arguing with people who had mastered the art of moving the goalposts in conversation, and now I was moving the game into a field where the lines cannot be shifted by guilt or charm. Once the letter for the truck was drafted and queued for certified mail, I turned to the next problem that had always sat in the corner like an unspoken roommate, because years ago my parents had opened a home equity line for kitchen repairs that somehow funded a pile of gear for Ethan's startup, and I had allowed my name to sit near the paperwork in a way that helped them qualify. So I wrote 2 more letters, calm, dated, referenced by account number, stating that any further draws would require my written consent, and I attached a formal freeze request that would lock the line until all parties signed a modification acknowledging actual use. I did not accuse or dramatize. I simply required the bank to enforce the terms that should have been enforced from the start. It felt almost surgical to write these notices without anger, and I think that is what scared me a little, not because I doubted myself, but because I could feel how quiet power works when you stop asking and start documenting, and the more I documented, the more I saw that what my family had always called helping was really a kind of unpaid administrative labor that ran on my fear of disappointing them. The ugliest surprise was the family short-term rental that my parents bragged about as though it proved we were entrepreneurial, which is funny because I found my name listed as the registered agent of the little liability company without any real authority, a position that cost me risk without benefit, so I filed the change with the state, removed myself as agent, and sent notice to the insurer that the actual operators were Linda and Mark, which automatically triggered a routine review that would require updated safety documentation and occupancy compliance, and I did it without malice because the purpose wasn't to humiliate them, it was to make sure that my name was no longer used as a shield for their shortcuts. I also notified the accountant, who had always called me first because he knew I was the one who could produce receipts, that I was stepping down from all bookkeeping and that any requests for documents would have to go directly to my parents, and the silence that followed that email was almost beautiful in its relief, because it felt like taking a heavy ring of keys off my belt and setting it on the table for someone else to carry. For good measure, and because I knew from experience that people make their worst choices when they feel cornered, I replaced every shared password, enabled multi-factor on anything that touched money, and wrote a single neutral update to the entire family noting that my accounts and credit were locked and that I would not authorize any inquiry for any reason except those I initiated myself. And while a small part of me worried that they would spin this as cold or ungrateful, a bigger part of me finally understood that boundaries do not require applause to be valid. I mailed the letters the same afternoon, and I kept the receipts like I was going to frame them. Then I turned off my phone and cooked dinner in a quiet apartment that felt more and more like a space I actually owned, not a storage unit for other people's emergencies. The next morning, before I had even finished my coffee, my phone lit up with a number that used to make my stomach drop, the lender's recovery department, and for the first time in my life, I did not run to pick up and explain myself or rush to promise a solution. I let it go to voicemail and watched the little icon appear, because the point of everything I had done was to make the paper speak for me, and now it was finally speaking. And if anyone wanted to argue, they would have to write it down, sign their name, and live with the terms the way I had lived with them for years. What I realized after sending out those letters and freezing every account tied to my name was that the financial part, as heavy as it felt, was still the easy layer, because numbers and clauses are clean. But the real battlefield with my parents was never just about money, it was about image, the carefully polished picture they held up to the community, to the church, to the neighbors, and even to relatives we hardly saw. Because for them reputation was oxygen, and everything else, including me, was a tool to maintain that glossy picture. So if I was going to reclaim my place in this story, I had to cut through not just the bills but the facade, and I had to do it in a way that left them exposed to the truth they had worked so hard to cover. My parents were the kind of people who could stand in the church foyer and accept compliments about their generosity, while completely ignoring the fact that the donation had been written from my account. And for years I let them do it because the idea of standing up and saying, "Actually, that was me," felt petty, even though I was the one paying. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that silence had been the leash. Because they knew I would never embarrass them, so they kept letting me clean up the messes in private while they collected praise in public. It was always about the story they could tell others. My brother was the charming one who just needed a little help, and I was the reliable one who could be depended on, except in practice that meant he got trips, applause, and excuses, while I got bills, late-night phone calls, and the unglamorous title of the good daughter. The problem with living inside someone else's story is that you start believing it until the receipts pile up and remind you that your role was never freely chosen. It was scripted, and I finally had the courage to start rewriting it. So when I received confirmation that I had been officially removed as the registered agent for the family's short-term rental company, I decided not to stop there, because the house itself had been skating on violations for months, ignoring HOA warnings about occupancy and failing to install basic safety devices that any inspector would flag, and since my name was no longer protecting them, I sent copies of the ignored notices to the HOA and to the insurer with a formal statement confirming I was not involved and would not assume liability. It was simple, professional, and factual, and the result was immediate. The insurer flagged the property and required updated inspections before coverage could continue, which meant bookings would be paused until everything was brought into compliance, and for the first time it was my parents, not me, who had to scramble to clean up their own shortcuts. At almost the same time, the venue where I had redirected the family's annual holiday dinner posted a photo on their website of the student who received the Carter Scholarship, smiling with a check in hand, and while I hadn't asked for any publicity, the post included my name as the sponsor, and suddenly people in our community were congratulating me instead of my parents. It wasn't just about credit, it was about truth finally reaching daylight, because when people asked my mom what happened to the family holiday event, she had no choice but to admit it wasn't happening this year, and when she tried to blame me for blindsiding them, I forwarded relatives the very email where I had laid out my boundaries weeks earlier, complete with the exact numbers and dates. There was nothing to argue with. The paper trail told the story, and it told it without me raising my voice. It was satisfying in a way that shouting never could be, because reputation, once cracked, spreads in every direction. And they could not stop the fact that people now saw them not as flawless providers, but as parents whose daughter had been quietly carrying the weight for years. And while I wasn't interested in humiliating them, I was interested in making sure that they finally faced the cost of the image they had built on my back. That is why I drafted one more message, this time to the accountant who had always come to me for organized files. reminding him that I was stepping down as unpaid bookkeeper effective immediately and that all future communication should go directly to Linda and Mark, and I attached every folder neatly zipped and labeled so there was no confusion. It wasn't cruel, it was clean, but the effect was devastating because now they had to explain deductions and statements on their own, without me smoothing it over. The more I did, the more I felt how much of my life had been consumed by invisible labor that no one clapped for but everyone depended on. I had been running the back office of my family like it was a company, except there was no paycheck, no gratitude, and no acknowledgement, only expectation, and walking away from it was like suddenly realizing you could breathe deeper than you thought possible. I didn't gloat, but I didn't hide either, because I wanted them to understand that the version of me who quietly kept the facade polished no longer existed. When their plane finally landed, the first voicemails waiting on their phones were not from me, begging for peace, but from the HOA, from the insurer, and from the accountant, all asking the same pointed question: who is handling this now? And the truth, which I had written into every email, every certified letter, and every file transfer, was simple and inescapable: whoever is handling it now, it is not me. By the time my parents' plane wheels touched back on American soil, I had already done the kind of work that doesn't show up in conversations or photos, but transforms your entire life. Because while they had been sitting poolside convincing themselves that I was sulking at home waiting for their return, I had been busy removing every last chain that tied me to them, and it wasn't just about cutting off phone lines or closing shared accounts anymore. It was about building a life that functioned. Without their approval, their excuses, or their endless demands, and once I started moving, I realized how much of my identity had been built on being available to them, and how liberating it felt to finally refuse that role. I signed a lease in a different city, not across the country but far enough that I could breathe without worrying they might show up at my door unannounced, and I moved essentials into storage, carefully selecting what was worth carrying into this new chapter and leaving behind anything that felt like it had been chosen for me rather than by me. At the same time, I accepted a better job offer, one that not only came with a higher salary, but also real health benefits and retirement contributions, things my parents had told me were luxuries when I tried to pursue them before because they preferred that I remain tied to their insurance plans and family coverage. For the first time in years, my paycheck would belong to me entirely, and my future would be secured by my own planning rather than dependent on whether my father remembered to pay a premium on time. I also went through every account that had a beneficiary line, from my retirement fund to the small life insurance policy I carried, and I removed their names entirely, replacing them with my chosen family. Friends who had been there when my own blood family treated me like a resource, and with the small scholarship fund I had started. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't spiteful, it was simply the final step in acknowledging that love without respect is nothing but an illusion, and paperwork, though it may feel cold, is the most reliable way to declare where your loyalty truly lies. By the time they rolled their luggage into the terminal, I had already scheduled a locksmith to rekey my apartment door, forwarded all my mail to the new address, and left behind nothing but silence in the place they assumed I would be waiting. They came back expecting to find me exactly as they had left me, ready to absorb their stories about the trip and maybe even apologize for being too sensitive, but instead, when they knocked, I did not answer, and when they called, I did not pick up. Instead, I sent one final text, not angry, not pleading, just factual: there's a folder in the mailbox. Inside the folder was not a letter begging for reconciliation, but a packet of documents, neatly organized, that laid out everything I had done in the weeks they were gone. There were copies of the boundary emails I had sent, the confirmation notices from banks and carriers, the letters to lenders, and most importantly, an itemized invoice of the money I had covered over the years with a settlement offer attached. The offer was not arbitrary. It was precise and fair, calculated down to the last dollar, and the terms were simple. If they sold the useless timeshare they had purchased for Ethan, a purchase they had justified as an investment, but which had become nothing but a financial sinkhole, they could cover the settlement in full. And if they did so within 30 days, I would consider the debt closed, and as a final courtesy, I would even donate a portion of the settlement to the scholarship fund in their names, allowing them at least one final chance to appear generous without stealing from me to do it. But the settlement had a condition attached that was worth more to me than the money itself, a written apology, signed by both of them, acknowledging the pattern of exploitation and releasing me from all so-called family obligations. It wasn't about making them grovel, it was about creating a permanent record that I could keep for myself, proof that I had not imagined the years of imbalance, proof that the weight I carried was real and that they had knowingly placed it on me. Without that acknowledgement, I told them, the settlement would expire, and I would consider the account permanently closed with no further communication expected. I didn't write it as a threat, and I didn't wait for their answer. I simply set the deadline, sealed the folder, and walked away, because the truth was that I no longer cared whether they chose pride or humility. For once, the outcome did not decide my future, because my future was already moving forward without them. I had built a clean exit, and whether or not they recognized it, I had already won. When I look back on those weeks, the part that stands out most is not the money, not the legal maneuvers, and not even the satisfaction of seeing them forced to face consequences. It is the realization that I had been living as though love and sacrifice were the same thing, and they are not. Love without respect is nothing more than dependency dressed up as tradition, and respect without boundaries is nothing more than exploitation disguised as duty. I had finally stepped off that stage, and I wasn't going back. They have 30 days to respond, but I'm not circling the calendar, and I'm not holding my breath. Whether they sign or not, I'm already living, and the truth is, the most brilliant revenge I ever pulled off wasn't the cancellation fees, the frozen lines of credit, or the scholarship redirect. It was showing them that the daughter they thought they owned had walked away without slamming the door, and by the time they realized it, she was already gone.